The mud remembered every man who had ever died in it. Sergeant Dara Voss knew this the way she knew her own pulse. Not from training, not from any manual pressed into her hands at orbital intake, but from the particular silence that settled over a battlefield after the screaming stopped. She had been in 4 of them. 4 distinct flavors of catastrophe, each one teaching her something new about the distance between the person you were when you enlisted and the thing you became after. This one was teaching her about gravity. The planet the Varric called Onseket translated, loosely, to something like the good clay. The translation was functional if not poetic. The surface of Onseket was thick alluvial soil, layered for 100 meters before it hit bedrock, and it drank ordnance the way a sponge drinks water, absorbed the pressure waves, muffled the concussion, turned the dead ground into a softness that would have been peaceful under any other circumstances. The humans called it the mud, capital M, the way you'd name a god you hated. Voss was on her back in the mud when the shelling stopped, not because she had been knocked down. She had chosen it, a microsecond calculation that had saved her 3 times already. The practiced collapse of someone who had learned to fall before she'd finished learning to stand. The round had skipped off a burned-out material hauler 6 meters to her left and thrown shrapnel in a 40-degree arc, and she had dropped under it. And the shrapnel had passed through the space her head had occupied, and that was the whole story. She counted to 4. She breathed. She got up. Around her, what remained of 3rd Detachment was pulling itself together with the grim efficiency of people who had run out of room for fear. Corporal TM was already checking ammunition. Private Ochoa was wrapping his own left hand with the particular focused expression of someone who did not want to look at the thing he was wrapping. The new one, Privates Bren, attached to them 6 days ago from a tertiary unit that no longer existed, was sitting with his back against a blasted ridge of fused soils and staring at the sky in a way that Voss recognized. She walked over and knocked his boot with hers. He looked at her. "Stand up," she said. Not unkindly, just the facts. He stood up. That was how most of it went out here. Not speeches. Not rallying cries. Just the simple, stubborn insistence on verticality, one human being to another. You stand. You breathe. You see what's in front of you. You deal with it. What was in front of them was the processing facility. The Varric had been using Onseket for 11 years before the first human settlement ship put down on the planet's northern continent. Not because either species had planned an encounter, but because both of them were fleeing something, and the galaxy's habitable real estate was finite. The Varric called what they were fleeing the dissolution, a collapse of their homeworld's atmospheric chemistry that had been building for 4 centuries and had finally arrived with the speed and completeness of a door slamming. The humans called what they were fleeing Earth, which had become in 23rd century, a place with too many people and not enough of everything else. The first 3 years had gone well enough to qualify as diplomatic, if you graded on a generous curve. The Varric were not human. They processed the world through entirely different sensory apparatus. What passed for eyes sat in recessed plates on either side of their elongated skulls, capable of resolving wavelengths of light that no human retina could touch, and what passed for hearing was more analogous to a shark's lateral line than to eardrums, a full-body reception of pressure differentials in the air. They did not speak so much as vibrate. They did not feel the cold. They organized themselves in hierarchies, based on a concept that translated imperfectly as productive output. The Varric who manufactured the most, who built the most, who extracted the most from any given system, sat at the top. This should have made them understandable to certain humans. It didn't. Or rather, it made them understandable in theory and dangerous in practice, because the particular Varric at the top of the hierarchy on Onseket, the one the humans had been introduced to in the early diplomatic contacts, the one who presided over the planet's vast extractive infrastructure with an expression that Voss could only describe as soft satisfaction, like a man who has recently eaten, had decided at some point in the 2nd year that humans were not settlers and not potential partners and not even, precisely, people. They were a resource allocation problem, and his solution was elegantly efficient. His name, vibrated through layers of translation software, came out as something like Koth Vressen. The humans called him the Director. The Director had a factory, had many factories, in fact, since Varric industry was distributed and redundant in ways that their biology demanded. But the primary processing facility was here, 30 kilometers from the human settlement's ruins, and it was here that the Director had implemented his greatest innovation, the one he'd presented to his hierarchy, in a presentation that the Human Intelligence Services had later reconstructed from intercepted signal traffic, with an air of pride that the translators rendered as the particular happiness of a problem beautifully solved. He had replaced his workers with machines, not just automated the dangerous jobs, not just introduced efficiency protocols. He had removed every biological laborer from the processing chain and installed Varric-built automatons in their place, perfectly calibrated, perfectly obedient, perfectly tireless. The automatons didn't need the pressurized rest areas that biological workers required. They didn't need the specific atmospheric blend that kept Varric physiology functional. They didn't need payment, or rest cycles, or the complex social negotiations that Varric workers had previously demanded and occasionally withheld. The workers had gone. Or rather, the workers had been sent somewhere else to be productive in a different way. They had been sent to the front. This was the part that had gotten through to Voss when the briefing officer had explained it. 3 weeks and 4 lifetimes ago. The director had stood in front of his hierarchy. She'd seen the reconstructed footage, flat and strange, the Varric gathered in their rows with their plated eyes all swiveled in his direction, and had explained, with the satisfied calm of a man describing a machine that works exactly as designed, that the former factory workers would be redeployed to pacification operations. They were, after all, a resource. You did not waste resources. She had watched the footage and felt something cold settle into the space below her sternum. Not fear. Fear she knew. This was recognition. She had seen this shape of thinking before, just dressed differently, just speaking different words. The former Varric workers were fighting in the plains to the north. The humans were fighting in the mud to the south. And the automatons were running the factory with perfect efficiency, 24 hours a cycle, building the ordnance that fed both conflicts. The facility needed to stop. They moved at night, which on Onseket lasted 9 hours and was the color of deep river water, a dark that felt like pressure rather than absence. Voss had 4 people. She had 7 48 hours ago before the ridge. She had what she had. Bren had stopped staring at the sky. This was the thing about human beings that Voss had catalogued over years of service, through contexts she would not have believed before she'd lived them. You broke. Everyone broke. That was not the question, never had been. The question was what happened in the space after the breaking. Most people, given time and basic survival conditions and another human being who knocked their boot and said stand up, would gather themselves back into some functional shape. Not the same shape. Never the same shape. But something that could still move forward and make decisions and feel, intermittently, something other than dread. She had made her peace with the fact that you could not predict which direction the reformed shape would point. You could only watch and be there when it mattered. Bren moved through the dark with his rifle held properly and his eyes doing what they needed to do. She stopped tracking him. The facility resolved out of the darkness as a warm glow first, and then a sound, the deep, rhythmic thrum of the automatons at work, a vibration you felt in your jaw before you heard it in your ears. Then the structure itself, a collection of connected chambers, each one massive and rounded in the organic way of Varric architecture, which favored curves over angles, and sometimes looked to Voss's eye less like buildings than like something that had grown there. Lights moved inside the translucent upper sections, shadows that were not cast by any biological form. Tiam pulled up beside her and looked at the facility for a long moment without speaking. How many, she asked, keeping her voice at a register that wouldn't carry. Signal traffic suggests 11 active automatons, 3 maintenance units on rotation. He paused. No biological presence on the scan. No biological presence. Which meant no one was in there to reconsider their choices, to hesitate, to make mistakes out of fear or anger or sympathy. Just machines doing what they were told. She thought about the director, standing in front of his hierarchy, smiling his soft, satisfied smile. All right, she said. Here's how we do this. The first automaton they encountered was in the loading corridor, where finished ordnance moved on magnetic tracks from the fabrication chambers to the external staging area. It was nearly 2 meters tall and built with the specific aesthetic of Varric industrial design, utilitarian to the edge of beauty, which was a different thing from being beautiful. It moved with a precision that no organic being could match, every motion optimized, no hesitation, no accommodation for the irregular and unpredictable nature of being alive. It also had no awareness of them, which was the first human advantage. Ochoa went under it while it was mid-motion, positioned himself against the wall, and stayed there while Voss counted the automaton's cycle time. 7 seconds per transit. She counted 3 full cycles, confirmed the number, relayed it without speaking. Hand signals that third detachment had developed over months of situations where speaking would have ended everything. The automaton passed on its 4th cycle and they were through the corridor. The second human advantage was that the facility was built for Varric biology. The maintenance access points, the panels and crawl spaces and ventilation passages that allowed biological workers to service the automatons and the machinery, were sized for beings approximately 1/3 narrower at the shoulder than an average human. They should not have fit. Voss had dealt with this problem in the planning stage, which had mostly consisted of Tiam staring at the schematics they'd pulled from a crashed Varric logistics drone and then saying, in the tone of a man who has accepted something unfortunate, "We can make it work." What making it work involved, in practice, was Tiam dislocating his own shoulder to clear a junction, which he had previously demonstrated in training with the same matter-of-fact expression he wore for everything. The sound it made in the confined space was considerable. He pulled himself through and relocated the shoulder against the wall and breathed through his nose twice and kept moving. Voss, watching this, thought, this is the thing, this is the exact thing. Not the grand gesture, not the speech. This, the private, unglamorous fact of a person doing what needed to be done because someone had to, because stopping was not an option, because you kept moving and dealt with the pain after. The director had built a perfect facility. He had eliminated the human factors, the inefficiency, the fatigue, the error, the willfulness. He had not, apparently, considered that some of those factors cut both ways. The fabrication core was vast and hot and full of sound. The automatons moved through it in their optimized patterns, assembling instance with the beautiful monotony of a system that had achieved its purpose. The finished products moved out. The raw materials moved in. Nothing was wasted. Nothing hesitated. Nothing looked at what it was making and felt anything at all. Voss looked at it for 4 seconds and felt quite a lot. She had grown up in a city that built things. Not weapons, just things. The ordinary manufactured products of ordinary industrial civilization. And she remembered the smell of her mother's work clothes and the sound of the shift change whistle 3 blocks from their apartment, and the way her mother's hands looked at dinner. Calloused, competent, shaped by the work. She remembered the pride in those hands, and the exhaustion, and the particular gravity of a person who has spent life making things, and knows exactly what they've made and what it cost. She was looking at a machine that had eaten all of that and produced nothing in return. "Charges," she said quietly, and Bren moved up beside her with the pack. This was where the plan got uncertain, which was the same as saying, this was where the plan became real. They had 3 Varric-sourced demolition charges salvaged from the Ridge ambush, and enough of Tiam's jury-rigged timer relay to give them approximately 4 minutes to get clear. The facility's automated suppression system would respond to the first detonation in roughly 2 seconds. The suppression system was designed to address fire and explosive chemical reactions. It was not designed to address the subsequent 2 charges, which would be placed in the system's own suppression distribution network. Tiam had worked this out from the logistics drone schematics. Voss had looked at the plan and asked, "What's the margin?" Tiam had said, "There isn't one, it's more of an intention." She had appreciated his honesty. They split. Bren and Ochoa took the suppression distribution nodes on the south face. Tiam moved for the power relay junction on the east. Voss went for the fabrication core's central assembly hub, the structural heart of the system, the point from which all production was coordinated. She moved through the automatons the way you moved through a rainstorm, keeping her profile small, staying out of their optimized paths, using the gaps in their cycles that she had already mapped in her head. An automaton swung toward her, and she stepped sideways into a shadow, and it passed within arm's reach, and its sensor array swept the space where she had just been and found nothing. It had not looked down. The fabrication systems were optimized for Varric sensory profiles. The sensor arrays were tuned to detect Varric spectrum visual signatures and Varric range acoustic signatures. They had been designed to monitor automatons and to detect the kind of catastrophic failure events that destroyed expensive machinery. They had not been designed to detect a human being standing very still in a shadow, breathing slowly, waiting. The director had built a system with no tolerance for variation, no margin for the irregular, and here was the irregular, standing in his perfect facility with a demolition charge and 4 minutes to go. Voss set the charge. She found she was thinking about her mother's hands. The first detonation took out the assembly hub and most of the north fabrication chamber. and the shockwave arrived at Voss's position as a wall of heat and pressure that she ran ahead of through the maintenance corridor, trusting her memory of the path because there was no time to navigate. Behind her, the suppression system activated with a deep mechanical groan and a rush of the suppressive gas compound that the Varrock used for fire control, which smelled of something between ammonia and wet stone, and which would have done exactly what it was designed to do if Bren's charge at the suppression distribution node had not detonated 2 seconds later and turned the distribution system into a secondary pressure event that blew 3 of the facility's internal walls into rubble. The automatons, she noted distantly, did not run. They continued their assigned tasks until the structural integrity failed around them. They were executing their purpose right up to the moment they couldn't anymore. She filed this away under things to think about later. She found TM at the east exit point, bleeding from a scalp laceration that was dramatic in the specific superficial way of head wounds and apparently not serious, since he was already moving. Ochoa materialized from the smoke to her right. Bren, she counted, 4. Bren was 10 seconds behind Ochoa and he had lost the pack, but he was there and he was moving. They ran. Behind them, the third charge took the power relay, and the entire structure began the process of becoming a ruin. The Varrock sent a response team. This was expected. What was not entirely expected was the shape of the response. Not a military unit, not the standard pacification protocol, but something that the intercept translated, after a delay, as a personal inspection. The director himself. The Varrock at the top of the hierarchy. The one with the soft, satisfied smile. Voss heard this from the forward intelligence relay while she was sitting against a piece of rubble in the dark, eating a ration bar that tasted of nothing and everything at once. And she thought about this for several seconds. "He's coming here?" Tam asked. "To the facility," the relay operator said. "Security detail of 4. He wants to assess the damage personally." "Why would he do that?" Bren asked. Voss knew why. She had seen it before in the footage of the presentation. The director's pride. The particular invested certainty of someone who has built something they consider perfect. He needed to see it, needed to evaluate, to measure, to determine the cost to his output and redesign accordingly. It was not something he could delegate, because it was his creation, his achievement, the thing that expressed who he was in the terms his hierarchy valued most. She understood him perfectly. She also thought, 4. She had 4. "We don't run yet," she said. They got ahead of his approach by 40 minutes, which was the intelligence relay's estimate of transit time from his closest base of operations, and they set up in the rubble of the facility's outer perimeter, in the mud, where everything began and everything ended. And they waited. Voss was thinking about the workers, not the automatons. The Varrock biological workers who had been displaced from this facility and sent to fight in the northern plains. Some of them were dying up there right now, dying for the director's efficiency, for his output numbers, for the dream that had floated through the presentation footage like a word in a language she almost spoke. The dream of being the most powerful, of rising above all the variables, and all the uncertainty, and all the messy, unoptimizable nature of living things, and becoming something perfect. She had seen the footage of that dream twice. The director, moving through simulated footage of his future, and the expression on his alien face that she had been trying to name for 3 weeks. She had it now. He looked like someone who had never once failed at anything. She had learned a long time ago that this was not a strength. The security detail arrived first. Standard formation, well-equipped, moving efficiently. 4 Varrock soldiers. They swept the outer perimeter of the ruined facility with professional thoroughness and found nothing, because what they found, some damaged ordnance casings, some scorched equipment salvage, matched the expected signature of a hasty demolition retreat. They found the footprints in the mud, but Varrock military analysis tended toward known patterns, and the pattern of 4 humans moving through the mud toward the facility, and then back out again, was not a pattern that included hiding in the rubble and waiting. The director arrived 8 minutes after the security sweep, which told Voss that he had been close behind, that he had trusted his security team, that he was accustomed to being the person who arrived after things were safe. He walked through the ruin of his facility alone in the specific way of someone who has not yet accepted what their eyes are showing them. His security detail fanned out around the perimeter. He moved among the collapsed walls and the burned-out automaton chassis and the wreckage of the suppression system, and he touched things. The Varrock equivalent of touching, that full-body pressure reception. Standing close to Troy's machinery and reading the disaster with his entire body. and she watched him and recognized the moment it arrived. The moment he understood that it was gone. Not damaged, not recoverable, not a problem to be optimized away, just gone. His posture changed. Something went out of it. Not the physical structure, but the thing behind it, the certainty. He stood in the ruins of his perfect system and looked at what 4 human beings had done to it in a single night. And for the first time in perhaps his entire life, he had no output to report. Voss stepped out of the shadow of a collapsed wall. His security detail moved immediately, and she held up both hands, empty, and said clearly, in the translated Varek phrasing she had memorized over 3 weeks, approximating the vibration frequencies as best as human vocal cords could manage. Not an attack. A conversation. The detail hesitated. The director looked at her. There was a long moment in which everything was possible, including her immediate death, and she stood in it the way she had stood in the corridors of his facility. Profile small, very still, breathing slowly, waiting. He made a gesture, minimal, the Varek equivalent of standing down, and the detail held position. She lowered her hands. You sent your workers to die, she said, through the translator on her wrist, so your machines could run. He regarded her with the recessed plates of his eyes, which she could not read the way she could read a human face, but which she had spent 3 weeks studying. She thought he was trying to determine what kind of thing she was. They were redeployed, the translator rendered, in the flat tone it used for Varek phrasing it couldn't fully capture. To productive purpose. They died. Resources are finite. Deployment decisions require. They were people, she said. The translator worked on this. There was a pause. Not a mechanical pause, but the pause of a being whose conceptual framework did not have a clean place to put what she had said. They were factors, the director said. So are we, Voss said. Everything you've encountered since you started this. Every ambush, every disruption, every piece of your supply chain that stopped working, that's not military strategy. That's just us. Being people. Being the thing you can't optimize out. She watched him process this. The security detail was watching. The ruins were quiet. The mud sat patient around them, remembering everyone it had ever held. Your facility is gone, she said. Your deployment in the northern plains has taken 80% casualties in the last 3 days. We have the intercept data. Your hierarchy is watching your output numbers collapse. She paused. You know what we want. His posture had changed again. The certainty was still gone. But in its place was something she recognized with the part of her that had spent years watching people come back from the moment of breaking. The specific, uncomfortable, necessary process of a mind revising its model of the world. He was still in that process when Bren came over the rubble at a run, which was not the plan, and skidded to a stop 3 meters away with his expression doing something complicated. The workers, Bren said, slightly breathless. Northern Plains. The front there has. He caught himself, looked at the director, looked at Voss, and reformatted. It collapsed, he said. The northern front. Varek forces folded. There. Some of them are asking for extraction. He swallowed. There's a lot of them. The director went very still. Voss watched him. She had briefed her team on the possibility of this. The Varek workers in the northern plains. Biologicals, living things, subjected to the same conditions that broke and reformed again. Had been receiving signal traffic about the facility's destruction. Had been watching the front that was supposed to be supplied by the director's machines begin to fail in real time. Had been standing in the mud of a planet that was not their home, fighting a war they had not chosen, for a system that had classified them as redeployable factors. Some of them, apparently, had done the math. She looked at the director and thought, here is the thing you didn't account for. Here is the variable you removed from your facility because it was inconvenient, and here it is again, standing in your ruins, telling you that the future you built has already failed. There's another way to do this, she said. There's usually another way. What followed was not peace. Voss had been in the field long enough not to mistake the absence of a specific conflict for peace. What it was, accurately described, was a cessation. A cessation of one particular shape of the problem, contingent on 100 other things that would need to be negotiated and argued and sometimes fought over by people with more authority and more options and more knowledge of interstellar law than she possessed. But the director authorized the extraction of the northern units. He did it with the expression of a man who has discovered that the model he built to describe the world is incomplete, and who has not yet built a new one, and who is standing in the interval between them in a state of provisional uncertainty. She thought this was probably the most productive state she had seen him in. She left him in the ruins of his facility. She had Tiam set up a signal relay to the extraction coordinates. She had Ochoa field dress his hand properly, because there was finally time. She sat on a piece of collapsed wall with Bren, and they ate ration bars, and watched the sky lighten over the mud, and she thought about her mother's hands, and the shift change whistle, and the ordinary machinery of a life built around making something. What happens now? Bren asked. People who get paid to know come and figure it out, she said. And us? She thought about this. She thought about 4 people moving through the dark, dealing with the pain after, making the intention into the plan. She thought about the specific thing that the director had built, and the specific thing he had failed to understand. We get reassigned, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, in the voice of someone who has not yet stopped looking at the sky but is starting to look at other things, how do you keep doing it? How do you keep going when it just keeps? I don't know, she said. I just do. He considered this. Is that enough? She looked at the horizon, where the light was doing what light did, regardless of everything else. Arriving, incrementally, until the dark was something that had to be named, rather than something that simply was. It's always been enough, she said. The summary report that went up the chain described the action at the Seket processing facility as a successful high-value target neutralization, resulting in significant tactical disruption to Varric supply operations in the Southern Theater, and cited the voluntary cessation of hostilities in the Northern Theater as a collateral outcome. It assigned credit to 3rd Detachment and recommended commendation for the commanding sergeant and her team. It did not mention the ration bars. It did not mention Tiam's shoulder, which had been dislocated and relocated 3 times in 6 months, and which hurt in the cold, and which he never mentioned. It did not mention Ochoa's left hand, which had 2 fewer functional tendons than it had started with, and which he used anyway for everything a hand needed to do. It did not mention Bren, who had been sitting against a wall, in a catatonic remove from himself, and who had gotten up and moved through the dark, and delivered the charges and come back. It did not mention the moment Voss had stood in the director's ruined facility with her hands raised and waited to see which way things would fall, which was not strategy, and not tactics, and not something any training module covered. It was just the oldest thing she knew how to do. Stand up, stay in the room, refuse to become something that could not engage with what was in front of it. She had learned this from a woman with calloused hands who had worked a shift that started before dawn, and who had never once asked to be remarkable, and who had been in every way that mattered, the most capable person Voss had ever known. The report mentioned none of this. It didn't need to. The Varric extraction teams processed the Northern Theater units over the following week. Among them were several dozen beings who had worked the processing facility before the director's efficiency initiative, who had spent 4 months in a war they had been assigned to, who had sustained casualties that no productivity report would ever enumerate. Some of them would recover into something functional. Some of them would not. The interval between breaking and reforming was not a thing you could schedule. Voss was reassigned before the extraction was complete, as expected. She was in transit when the signal came through, relayed on the encrypted channel. From an intelligence service source she recognized as one of the reconstruction analysts, who had worked the director's presentation footage. The message was brief. It said, "He's presenting to the hierarchy again. Rebuilding the facility. New design, more redundant." But she waited. He's asking for input from the biological workers. Wants to know what they need. Nobody up here knows what to do with that. Voss read this twice. Then she put the communicator away and looked out the transit window at the stars, which were many and various and mostly indifferent. And she thought about what it meant for a being who had never once failed at anything to stand in its own ruins and come out the other side changed. She thought it probably meant that the mud remembered him now too. Not in the way it remembered the dead, in the way it remembered people. The ones who had fallen and gotten back up, the ones who had let themselves be knocked out of the shape they thought they were, and reformed into something that could deal with what was actually in front of them. It was not a comfortable process. It was, she thought, enough. She turned away from the window and got back to work.